You ever add a tool to your shop, and then after using it for a few months, you ask yourself, man, how'd I ever get along without this thing? Well, that is sincerely how I feel about this CO2 laser. It's opened up so many possibilities and opportunities for me that I wouldn't have had otherwise, and I have used the heck out of it since getting it. It's truly been a blessing. Now, if you've watched my channel for any length of time, one thing you know I love doing is inlays on the CNC machine. Well, with the thanks of YouTube, I have learned how to do inlays on the laser. Now, if you've seen other YouTube videos on inlays, they're generally just one inlay, but we're going to do some multiple inlays today, and I've picked out two images, a butterfly and a tiger. The butterfly was meant to show a very easy one to do, and the tiger was going to show you a little bit more advanced, a little bit more difficult to do. And as luck would have it, the tiger turned out flawless, but the butterfly failed, and we'll talk about that later. But here's how you do it. First, you want to pick out the wood that you intend to be the base, or what you'll cut the pocket in that the inlay will fit down into. In these examples, I've picked maple, hard maple. And then depending on the images that you use for your inlay, you got to pick the veneer that you'll use for the color of the inlays. So try to find a veneer that matches the closest color that you have in mind. And before we make our first burn, we have to determine how deep to burn the pocket that the veneer will sit down into, and we gauge that by finding out how thick the veneer is. And here, most of the veneer I have here averages just a little over 20 thousandths. So that is what we'll want to set the laser up to burn that deep. And what I did here is I took the wood, and whatever wood that you use for your base, you'll want to do a test like this, because some wood is more dense than others, and it'll take a different setting to get the depth that you need. And then once I have that done, I just take my calipers and do a quick measurement to see how deep it was. And 50% got us right around 35 thousandths, and that's way too deep. You want to have it between 20 and 30 thousandths. The veneer is 20 thousandths. You want the pocket just a little deeper. We're at 28 right here, and that's probably going to be what we end up choosing. We'll check 40% just in case, and sure enough, it's right at the 20 thousandths mark. You don't want the veneer to be proud of the pocket. You want it to sit down in it just a little ways. I wanted to show you how to set up the layers in light burn. First, a disclaimer, there's about a half a dozen different ways that you could screw this up. This is just one of them. So this isn't the end-all be-all settings. Your workflow may vary, and I'm sure you can figure out a better way to do this, but this will be a good starting point if you've never done this before. First thing I do is I create a boundary. Like I mentioned a while ago, the wood that I'm using is 4-inch square, so I created a 4-inch square boundary. And also, this is my origin in the bottom left-hand corner. When I set my wood down, I know that I'm burning in the center of that wood, and I'm able to center up the image inside that boundary to get that. So I bought this butterfly, this vector off of Etsy. It's just a simple vector, but it has multiple parts to it, and I split those up into two layers. The first layer is just the outline of the butterfly, and what we'll do is we'll engrave that into the wood, and then once that's done, we will engrave the outside of the veneer and then glue that into the first pocket that we burned. Once that glue dries, we'll bring it back, put it back in the laser, and then we'll run the second operation that will burn this image into the first inlay that we put in. And then lastly, we will cut this out as an inlay and glue that in. So, and if you'll notice, it's worth mentioning, now 900 inches a minute is the speed that I use on my laser, but the important bit here is that test burn that I did a while ago, and we determined that 45% was what I needed to get the proper depth into the base cut. So that's how I have this set here. If you have a CO2 laser, I'm just using 300 DPI. If you have a diode laser, you don't have to worry about that. But this is basically a good starting point for the settings that you might want to use. And we'll come back in a minute and I'll show you how to cut out the inlay. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, this is the base engraving for the butterfly to cut out that pocket for the inlay. And this will be the base cut for the Tiger. Now, I didn't show the setup on that, but it's almost identical to how do you set up the butterflies. So it's the same procedure. Now that we've got our base cut out, now we've got to work on the inlay. You can use the same image and settings that you used on the base cut, but we're going to have to change up a few things to get the inlay to cut out properly. First thing you want to do, and because this is a negative or a mirror image of your base, we've got to flip this 180 degrees. You can't trust that this is perfectly symmetrical. It may not fit into the base if there's any kind of inconsistencies on each side. So what you'll do is you'll choose all the vectors, and I go up here and very simply use the mirror selection up here at the top, and we'll flip it 180 degrees. Now I clicked it and you didn't see anything, but again, it's just a safe thing to do to make sure that the inlay fits into the pocket correctly. And what we'll do, we'll turn off this second cut, and this is what we want to cut the inlay out of to fit into the pocket. And what we'll do is we'll select that vector, and then we'll do an offset, and I used about 1/8 of an inch here. And what this does is creates a boundary for the laser to cut inside of, and this is what we want it to look like. We want it to leave this wood but burn away on the outside, and that's what that offset cut does. The second thing we want to do, we're still going to use the same speed and power, but what we want to do is add a second pass to that burn, and I'll show you in just a second why we need to do that. And then after we have done with that one, then we'll come back and we will cut the second one. Now what you can do in this particular situation is we can use that same outline, and we'll use layer 1, and we will do the same thing here. We will burn the second run, we will run a second pass, and this is what you will see for that, and then that is what we will press into the base pocket that we cut into that inlay. Now for us to cut the inlay out, we're going to need a couple of things. We need aluminum tape and some regular painter's tape. I've got all this down in the description, Amazon links, if anybody wants to use what I'm using. But first thing I'm doing is I'm taking another 4-inch square block, and I'm going to cut out the veneer the same size as that. And we'll do the same thing using the aluminum tape. I'll cut off a 4-inch by 4-inch piece of that as well. And then once you have it cut out to the size that you want, just tear off the back off the aluminum tape and tape that onto the veneer. And the reason why you want to use this aluminum tape is because the beauty of this is the laser won't cut the aluminum tape, and it leaves a backing for your inlay to stick to. There's going to be some really small details cut out on this, and you're going to need something to hold it in place as you glue it into the base. And this is what does it. Does a great job too. And I use this roller to make sure it's pressed down and the glue adheres good to the wood. And then once I have that done, I just tape it down to that block. And I'm using this block as just a pedestal to set it on. You don't have to use it, but you'll want to find a way to secure the wood down, the tape and all, onto the bed of your laser. I found that this wood was just a perfect way to do that. Kind of like a jig. And then once that's done, you'll want to run the operation to cut out the inlay from the veneer. Now if you're noticing where the laser is cutting, it's leaving some residual wood and glue. You could bump up the power to get all this in one pass, but I've noticed that it kind of scorches the wood if you've got the laser too hot. So 2 passes are actually a little safer thing to do without damaging the wood, because that aluminum tape will get hot. And another reason when you want to tape it down is because it will curl up on you when that laser hitting it up and heating it up. So two passes at a mild power does the trick. Now the trickiest part of this whole project is getting the veneer glued into the pocket. It's so thin, it's almost like trying to glue paper into paper. It's not like a CNC inlay where you're using wood and you're taking a 1/4 inch inlay and trying to pop it into a 1/4 inch deep pocket. This will test your patience. So what I do is I try to cut as close to the inlay as I can to keep it as an outline so I can line it up with the pocket when I glue that in. And I'll just sand off the soot just a little bit, because you're going to see that once your glue mixes in with that soot, it's going to discolor it just a little bit. You want to try to find a reference point on the inlay, and what I do is I press that foil down to try to show the outline of the inlay, and that is what I line up with the pocket. I'm going to start at the bottom here and do my best to try to get it lined up in there. And later I'll show you, I learned that using a little bit more glue, actually more glue than you need, but it just kind of lubricates it and helps it slide down in there. It's a little more messy, but it increases the opportunity for your inlay to be successful. And while we're waiting on that glue to dry, we'll go ahead and cut out the first inlay for the tiger. Now I don't know what kind of wood this veneer was made from, but apparently it's a little denser than the other, and I noticed that it left a little bit more residual wood and glue even after the second pass. So just to be safe, I'll run a 3rd pass over this just to make sure I got it cleaned up good. And it's not the outside of the inlay that I'm worried about. It's all the little details on the inside of the inlay, like around his claws and whatnot, that I wanted to make sure that it was cleaned out well. And I'll do the same thing for the tiger that I did the butterfly. This one's a little bit more difficult because there's way more details. I guess the image is a little busier, if you will. And so it's a little bit more difficult to get pressed into the pocket as the butterfly was. It's worth mentioning, when I was doing some test cuts of this, I actually tried slow drying CA instead of wood glue. That way I thought I'd have a quicker turnaround time, but sometimes if you don't, this is about the 4th tiger I've done, so I've done this enough. Your first try may take you a lot longer, and the CA would dry before I had a chance to press the inlay in. So I found that wood glue was a lot more forgiving than CA was. Now, I only let this glue dry about 2 or 3 hours before I started peeling the tape off of it, and I learned a hard lesson because of it. One thing you'll want to develop doing these things is a lot of patience, and do not get into a hurry, because if you do, bad things happen. This ruined my day. My first thought was to just do it over again, but I thought this would be a wonderful opportunity to see if I could fix it. My daddy always said it's not how good you are at doing something right, it's how well you recover from it when you screw up. So I'm going to see if I can fix this. And this I will use CA glue on. Like I mentioned, this particular image is a lot more simple than the tiger was, and I think I can get it. So I just lined the pieces up in there and then squirted a fairly liberal amount of CA glue in there to try to get it glued in. And luckily it worked. But I think the CA glue actually caused some issues later on down the road. We'll talk about that later. But I was just happy I was able to get it salvaged. Now the tiger, after the butterfly debacle, I actually closed up the shop and went in for the night, and I let this dry overnight. I certainly didn't want this peeling out. And thankfully this turned out okay. Now it doesn't look very pretty right now because of all the glue, but once you get it sanded down nice and smooth, all the details start standing out. It looks a lot better. Now once all the glue dried on the first inlay, now I am cutting the second layer that we created for the base. And of course, this is the second inlay operation to cut out the final inlay that'll go into the butterfly. And then finally, we'll cut out the second inlay for the tiger. Trying to press these small inlays, these thin inlays into these little thin pockets, shallow pockets, can be fairly difficult. I've learned to add a lot more glue to make everything slippery, to lubricate it all in, for my fingers to slide over it so I can actually feel it slide into the pocket. So Don't talk bad about me because I'm using so much glue, but there is a method to my madness. And I'm not going to risk that inlay popping out anymore. These I'm going to clamp, and I'm going to allow the glue to dry overnight so it'll cure. Now, I'm sure I didn't need this many clamps for such a small piece, but better safe than sorry, right? Like I mentioned, it looks like crap right now, but it'll look a lot better once I sand it. And I just used 180. I didn't want to use a real coarse sandpaper because I was afraid I'd get down into the details too much, considering how thin it was. And it took a little longer than normal, but it turned out all right. I'm pretty disappointed in how the butterfly turned out. It just didn't turn out well at all. The dark areas around the edge of the wings, maybe that's from the CA glue, I don't know, but I noticed that it got more prominent as I sanded it. Here's a test piece that I did. It didn't turn out that way. So I'm going to think it's a cross between the veneer that I used and maybe that CA glue that I had to fix my uh-oh. Now the tiger turned out fantastic. I am very proud of that. The irony of it is the tiger was a more difficult inlay to do, but it turned out 10 times better than the butterfly, which was the more simple one to do. But there you have it, folks. That's how you do laser inlays. They're fun to do. It takes a level of patience to do them. High probability you're going to screw up your first or second one, so don't burn up no expensive wood on your first try. But I think they would add a lot to a project, putting it on the side of something that you've made, or you can go even smaller with them. You can't get this level of detail out of a CNC machine to be so small. I'm really pleased with how it turned out, and I really appreciate Monport Laser for sponsoring this video. If you're interested in a Monport laser, please use my coupon code MSWoodworks, and you'll get 5% off anything you buy. So, as always, thank you so much for watching. See you next time.